Mary Ellen wiped the sweat from her forehead as she scrubbed the wooden floors of the Henderson ranch house. The Kansas sun beat down mercilessly through the windows, making the already difficult work even harder. Her hands were raw and cracked from years of washing, cleaning, and cooking for the wealthy rancher family. At 23, she looked older than her years. With tired eyes that had seen too much hardship, she had come to work for the Hendersons 5 years ago, desperate and alone after her parents died in a cholera outbreak back in Missouri. The job paid little, but it gave her a roof over her head and food in her belly. That was more than many women in her situation could hope for in 1867. The Henderson family treated her like she was invisible most days. Mrs. Henderson, a stern woman with sharp features, would bark orders without even looking at Mary Ellen. "Girl, the silver needs polishing," she would say. Or, "The chickens need feeding. Never please, never thank you." Just commands that Mary Ellen followed without complaint. Mr. Henderson was worse in some ways. He would stare at Mary Ellen when his wife wasn't looking, making her skin crawl with discomfort. She had learned to stay out of his way as much as possible, especially when he had been drinking. The 3 Henderson children, 2 boys and a girl, barely acknowledged her existence except to make more messes for her to clean up. Mary Ellen's small room was in the basement, damp and cold in winter, stifling hot in summer. Her few possessions fit in a single wooden crate: 2 worn dresses, a pair of boots with holes in the soles, her mother's Bible, and a silver locket that had belonged to her grandmother. It wasn't much, but it was all she had left of her old life. The work was endless. She woke before dawn to start the fire and prepare breakfast. Then came the cleaning, the washing, the mending, the cooking of lunch, more cleaning, dinner preparation, and finally the evening cleanup. By the time she collapsed into her narrow bed, she was too exhausted to do anything but sleep. But there was one thing that kept Mary Ellen's spirit alive during those long, difficult days. She loved to sing. When she was alone in the kitchen or hanging laundry outside, soft melodies would flow from her lips. They were songs her mother had taught her, hymns from church, and sometimes little tunes she made up herself. Her voice was clear and sweet, though she didn't think anyone ever heard her. The singing reminded her of better times, when she was a child sitting on her mother's lap, learning lullabies and folk songs. It connected her to memories of love and warmth, things that seemed so far away now. Sometimes she would catch herself humming while she worked, and for just a moment the drudgery would lift. The Henderson ranch was large, sprawling across thousands of acres of prairie land. Mr. Henderson raised cattle and horses, and employed several cowboys to help with the work. Mary Ellen rarely interacted with these men, except to serve them meals when they ate at the main house. They were rough, weathered men who spoke little and ate quickly before returning to their duties. Recently, there had been talk of Indian troubles in the area. The Sioux were growing more restless as white settlers continued to push into their traditional hunting grounds. Mr. Henderson had hired extra men for protection, and Mary Ellen noticed the tension in the house. Mrs. Henderson jumped at every unexpected sound, and the children were forbidden from wandering too far from the house. Mary Ellen tried not to worry too much about such things. She had enough problems of her own without borrowing trouble. Besides, she reasoned, what did she have that anyone would want to take? Her life was already as difficult as it could be. One evening, as she was finishing the dinner dishes, Mary Ellen overheard Mr. Henderson talking to his foreman about a half-breed scout who sometimes worked for the army. "That Injun Jack Two Eagles came by today looking for work," the foreman said. "Says he knows these parts better than anyone." "I don't trust him," Mr. Henderson replied. "Half-breeds belong to neither world. You never know where their loyalties lie." Mary Ellen didn't think much about this conversation at the time. Her world was confined to the ranch house and its immediate surroundings. The larger conflicts between settlers and Indians seemed as distant as the stars. As autumn approached, the work became even harder. There were vegetables to preserve, meat to smoke, and preparations to make for the harsh Kansas winter. Mary Ellen's days stretched even longer, and she fell into bed each night more exhausted than before. It was during this busy time that she first noticed the little girl. She was perhaps 4 years old, with dark hair and eyes that seemed too serious for such a young child. Mary Ellen would catch glimpses of her playing alone near the edge of the ranch property, always staying just out of sight when any of the Henderson family appeared. The child looked thin and poorly dressed, and Mary Ellen's heart went out to her. When she could spare a moment, She would leave small bits of food where the girl might find them: a biscuit, an apple, a piece of cheese wrapped in cloth. The offerings always disappeared, though Mary Ellen never saw who took them. She began to wonder about this mysterious child. Where did she come from? Where were her parents? Why was she always alone? The questions nagged at Mary Ellen, adding another layer of concern to her already burdened mind. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Mary Ellen was hanging the last of the laundry when she heard a sound that made her freeze. It was crying, the soft, heartbroken sobbing of a child. Following the sound, she found the little girl huddled behind the chicken coop, tears streaming down her dirty face. Without thinking, Mary Ellen knelt beside the child and gently touched her shoulder. "What's wrong, little one?" she asked softly. The girl looked up with startled eyes but didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into Mary Ellen's touch, as if starved for human kindness. Mary Ellen gathered the child into her arms and began to sing softly. One of the lullabies her own mother had sung to her years ago. The little girl's crying gradually subsided, and she relaxed against Mary Ellen's chest. They sat there together as darkness fell, two lonely souls finding comfort in each other's presence. That night marked the beginning of a secret friendship that would change both their lives forever. Mary Ellen didn't know that someone was watching from the shadows, someone who had been searching for this very child. She didn't know that her simple act of kindness had been witnessed by eyes that had seen too much sorrow and loss. Jack Two Eagles crouched in the tall grass at the edge of the Henderson property, his trained eyes scanning the ranch buildings. The half-breed scout had been tracking his daughter for 3 days, following a trail that had led him across miles of prairie. His heart pounded with a mixture of hope and fear as he watched the main house, looking for any sign of the child he had lost. Standing 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and weathered skin that spoke of years spent under the open sky, Jack carried the features of both his Sioux mother and his white father. His black hair hung to his shoulders, and his dark eyes held the wariness of a man who belonged fully to neither world. The blue cavalry shirt he wore was practical rather than patriotic. It helped him move between the white and Indian communities when his work required it. 3 months ago, his life had been torn apart when his wife, Summer Moon, died of a fever that swept through their small camp. She had been the daughter of a Sioux chief, beautiful and strong, who had chosen to love a mixed-blood man despite her father's disapproval. Their daughter, Little Star, was the light of both their lives, a bridge between two worlds that often seemed at war with each other. After Summer Moon's death, Jack had struggled to care for his 4-year-old daughter while continuing his work as an Army Scout. The military needed men who could speak both languages and understand both cultures, especially as tensions with the Sioux increased. It was dangerous work that took him away for weeks at a time, leaving Little Star with an elderly Sioux woman named Grandmother Willow. But Grandmother Willow had grown ill, and during one of Jack's absences, the old woman had died in her sleep. When he returned to find his daughter gone, Jack's world collapsed. The other members of the small camp said Little Star had wandered off, probably taken by wolves or died of exposure. They told him to accept her loss and move on. Jack refused to believe his daughter was dead. He could feel it in his bones that she was still alive somewhere. So he had begun a desperate search, following every trail, checking every settlement, asking questions at every trading post and army fort. His inquiries had finally led him to reports of a small Indian girl seen near the Henderson ranch. Now, as he watched from his hiding place, Jack saw a woman emerge from the house carrying a basket of wet clothes. She was young and slender, with brown hair pulled back in a simple bun and a face that looked kind despite the weariness he could see even from a distance. She moved with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to hard work. As the woman began hanging clothes on a line stretched between 2 posts, Jack heard something that made his breath catch in his throat. It was singing, a soft, gentle melody that floated across the evening air. The voice was sweet and pure, filled with a sadness that touched his heart, but it wasn't the song itself that captured his attention. It was the small figure that emerged from behind the chicken coop, drawn by the music like a moth to flame. Jack's heart nearly stopped when he recognized the familiar features of his daughter. Little Star looked thinner than when he had last seen her, and her clothes were dirty and torn, but she was alive and moving under her own power. The woman noticed the child too, and Jack watched as she set down her basket and knelt beside his daughter. He couldn't hear the words they exchanged, but he could see the gentleness in the woman's movements as she gathered little Star into her arms. The singing resumed, and this time Jack could see how it soothed his daughter, how she relaxed against the stranger's chest. Emotions warred within Jack's heart. Relief flooded through him at finding little Star alive, but caution kept him frozen in place. He had learned to be suspicious of white people's motives, especially when it came to Indian children. Some would take them in only to use them as servants or to try to force them to abandon their heritage entirely. But as he watched this woman rock his daughter and sing to her with obvious tenderness, Jack sensed something different. There was no calculation in her actions, no sense that she was performing for an audience. This was genuine kindness, the kind that came from a heart that understood loneliness and pain. Jack remained hidden as the woman eventually led little Star into the house through a back door. He circled the property carefully, using skills learned from years of scouting and hunting. The ranch was well defended, with armed men posted at strategic points, but Jack moved like a shadow, unseen and unheard. Through a kitchen window, he watched the woman give his daughter a bowl of warm food and a cup of milk. Little Star ate hungrily, as if she hadn't had a proper meal in days. The woman sat beside her, continuing to sing softly, and Jack could see his daughter's eyes beginning to droop with exhaustion and contentment. When little Star had finished eating, the woman led her to what appeared to be a small storage room off the kitchen. Jack saw her lay out blankets on the floor and settle the child down to sleep. She sat beside the makeshift bed for a long time, stroking little Star's hair and humming lullabies until the little girl fell into peaceful sleep. As Jack watched this tender scene, his opinion of the woman began to shift. She wasn't keeping his daughter as a servant or a curiosity. She was caring for her with the devotion of a mother, asking nothing in return. The songs she sang were filled with love and longing, as if she too had experienced great loss. But Jack also noticed other things during his surveillance. He saw how the white family in the big house treated this woman, ordering her around, speaking to her harshly, working her from dawn until late into the night. She was clearly not family but hired help, and not well-treated hired help at that. The irony wasn't lost on him. His daughter, a Sioux child, was being cared for by a woman who was herself barely better than a slave in this household. Two outcasts had found each other in a world that seemed determined to crush anyone who didn't fit its narrow definitions of worth. As the night deepened, Jack retreated to a safe distance to plan his next move. Simply taking little Star and leaving wasn't an option. The child had obviously been through trauma and needed gentle handling. Besides, he had nowhere to take her that would be safe. The old camp was broken up and winter was coming. More importantly, he found himself curious about this woman who had shown such kindness to his daughter. What was her story? How had she ended up in this place, working for people who clearly didn't value her? And why had she risked her own position to care for a strange child that others might view as a burden or a threat? Jack settled in for a long watch. Tomorrow he would find a way to approach this mysterious woman and learn more about her situation. He needed to understand her motivations before he could trust her with the most precious thing in his world, his daughter's safety and happiness. The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of singing from the house. The woman was still awake, still singing her gentle songs. Jack closed his eyes and listened, feeling something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced since Summer Moon's death. It was the dangerous flutter of hope and the even more dangerous whisper of possibility. Mary Ellen woke before dawn, as she had every day for the past 5 years. But this morning was different. In the storage room off the kitchen, a small girl slept peacefully on the blankets Mary Ellen had arranged. The child had given her name as Little Star, speaking in a mixture of English and what Mary Ellen guessed was an Indian language. As Mary Ellen went about her morning tasks, she found herself humming softly, something she hadn't done in the early hours before. The presence of the child had awakened something in her heart that had been sleeping, a maternal instinct she thought she would never have the chance to express. She prepared a small breakfast for Little Star, hiding an extra biscuit and some bacon in her apron pocket. When the child woke, Mary Ellen was struck again by how serious and watchful she seemed for someone so young. Little Star ate quietly, her dark eyes constantly scanning the room as if expecting danger. "Where is your family?" Mary Ellen asked gently as she knelt beside the child. Little Star's face clouded over. and she spoke a few words in her native language that Mary Ellen couldn't understand. But the sadness in the child's voice was universal. Mary Ellen spent the morning teaching little Star to stay hidden when the Henderson family was around. She showed her the best places to wait quietly, behind the pantry door, in the root cellar, or in the small space under the back stairs. The child learned quickly, seeming to understand instinctively that discovery could mean separation. During her afternoon chores, Mary Ellen found herself constantly aware of little Star's presence. The child followed her around like a shadow when it was safe, watching everything Mary Ellen did with curious eyes. When Mary Ellen sang while she worked, little Star would sometimes hum along, creating a sweet harmony that made the tedious tasks feel lighter. It was while she was beating rugs outside that Mary Ellen first sensed they were being watched. The feeling was subtle at first, just a prickle at the back of her neck, an awareness that eyes were upon her. She paused in her work and scanned the tree line beyond the ranch buildings, but saw nothing unusual. Little Star, however, had gone very still beside her. The child was staring intently at the same area where Mary Ellen had been looking, and there was something in her expression that seemed like recognition mixed with fear. "What is it, sweetheart?" Mary Ellen asked softly, but little Star just shook her head and moved closer to Mary Ellen's skirts. That evening, after the Henderson family had retired to their rooms, Mary Ellen sat with little Star in the kitchen. She had found some colored threads and was teaching the child to make simple patterns by weaving them together. Little Star showed remarkable skill for someone so young, her small fingers moving with precision and grace. "You're a clever little thing," Mary Ellen murmured, smoothing the child's dark hair. "Someone taught you well?" At these words, little Star looked up with eyes that suddenly brimmed with tears. She spoke a single word that sounded like "Papa," and Mary Ellen's heart clenched with understanding. This child wasn't lost. She was missing her father. Mary Ellen gathered little Star into her arms and began to sing a lullaby about a little bird separated from its family. As she sang, she wondered about the child's story. Was her father looking for her? Was he even alive? The questions troubled Mary Ellen, but she pushed them aside. Right now, her job was to care for this precious little girl who had somehow found her way into her heart. Outside, unbeknownst to Mary Ellen, Jack Two Eagles was indeed watching. He had spent the day learning the routines of the ranch, noting when it was safe to move closer and when he needed to stay hidden. He had seen how his daughter clung to the kind woman, and how naturally the woman cared for her. As the days passed, Mary Ellen and little Star fell into a comfortable routine. The child proved to be a quick learner, picking up English words rapidly and showing Mary Ellen some of her own language in return. Mary Ellen learned that eight meant father and Ina meant mother. When little Star said Ina, her voice carried a deep sadness that broke Mary Ellen's heart. Mary Ellen began to realize that caring for little Star was changing her in ways she hadn't expected. The loneliness that had been her constant companion for years was lifting. She had someone to protect, someone who needed her, someone who looked at her with love and trust. For the first time since her parents' death, Mary Ellen felt like she had a purpose beyond mere survival. But she also knew their situation couldn't last forever. The Henderson family would eventually discover little Star, and Mary Ellen dreaded what might happen then. She had heard Mrs. Henderson's harsh opinions about Indians, and she knew Mr. Henderson would see the child as nothing more than a problem to be solved. One evening, as Mary Ellen was singing Little Star to sleep, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. Heavy footsteps were approaching the kitchen, accompanied by the slurred speech that meant Mr. Henderson had been drinking heavily. "Where's that girl?" she heard him mutter. "Need to talk to her about her duties." Mary Ellen's hands trembled as she quickly covered little Star with a blanket and pressed a finger to her lips, signaling for silence. She slipped out of the storage room and closed the door quietly behind her, just as Mr. Henderson stumbled into the kitchen. He was worse than she had ever seen him, swaying on his feet and looking at her with eyes that made her skin crawl. "There you are," he said, his words slurring together. "Been looking for you, Mary Ellen. Time we had to talk about appreciation." Mary Ellen backed away from him, her heart pounding. "It's late, Mr. Henderson. Perhaps we could speak tomorrow when—" "Now," he interrupted, lurching toward her. "Been watching you, girl. You're not getting any younger. Time you learned to be grateful for what you have here." Mary Ellen continued backing away until she felt the kitchen table behind her. Mr. Henderson reached out to grab her arm, and she knew she was in serious trouble. In the storage room, she could hear little Star beginning to whimper softly, sensing the danger even through the closed door. Just as Mr. Henderson's hand was about to close on her wrist, a shadow moved past the kitchen window. Both Mary Ellen and Mr. Henderson froze as they heard a sound none of them expected, a low, threatening growl from just outside the door. Mr. Henderson's eyes widened in alarm. "What in hell?" The back door opened slowly, and a tall figure stepped into the kitchen. Mary Ellen's breath caught in her throat as she saw him clearly for the first time. A man with long dark hair and features that spoke of mixed heritage, wearing buckskins and moccasins that had allowed him to approach in complete silence. "Evening," the stranger said quietly, his voice calm but carrying an undertone that made Mr. Henderson step back quickly. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Jack Two Eagles had been watching the scene through the window, and when he saw the danger Mary Ellen was in, he hadn't hesitated to act. His daughter's protector needed protection of her own, and he was more than willing to provide it. "Who the hell are you?" Mr. Henderson demanded, his drunken courage warring with sudden fear. "Just a man looking for his daughter," Jack replied evenly, his eyes never leaving Henderson's face. "Heard there might be a lost child around these parts." The kitchen fell into a tense silence as Jack Two Eagles faced Mr. Henderson. Mary Ellen pressed herself against the table, her heart racing as she tried to understand what was happening. The stranger's presence filled the room with a quiet power that made even the drunk rancher hesitate. "Your daughter?" Henderson scoffed, though his voice lacked its earlier boldness. "What makes you think she's here? This is private property." Jack's dark eyes shifted briefly to Mary Ellen, and she saw something in his gaze that made her pulse quicken. Not fear, but recognition. He knew something about little Star. The pieces began falling into place in her mind, and she realized this man wasn't a stranger at all. He was the child's father. "A man hears things," Jack said calmly, his hands relaxed at his sides but ready to move if needed. "Stories about a kind woman who found a lost little girl. Stories about someone who sings lullabies in the darkness." Mary Ellen's breath caught. He had been watching them. For how long? And why hadn't he approached her directly? Henderson swayed slightly, his alcohol-clouded mind struggling to process the situation. "I don't know what you're talking about. There's no Indian brat here, and even if there was, what claim would a half-breed like you have on anything?" The insult hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. Jack's expression didn't change, but Mary Ellen saw his jaw tighten slightly. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of controlled violence. "I suggest you choose your next words more carefully," Jack said quietly. "A man can only hear so much before he stops being patient." Henderson must have heard the danger in those words because he took another step backward. But his pride and the whiskey in his blood made him reckless. "You can't threaten me on my own land. I'll have you arrested. The Army doesn't look kindly on Indians who make trouble." "The Army knows me well," Jack replied with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Lieutenant Colonel Morrison at Fort Harker considers me quite valuable. I wonder what he would think about a rancher who harbors stolen children." The accusation hit its mark. Henderson's face went pale, and Mary Ellen realized that her secret hadn't been as well kept as she had thought. Somehow this man had been watching them long enough to know about Little Star's presence. Before anyone could speak again, a small sound came from the storage room, the soft whimper of a frightened child. All three adults turned toward the door, and Mary Ellen saw Jack's entire demeanor change. The controlled threat was replaced by desperate longing. "Papa." The word was barely a whisper, spoken in a child's voice filled with hope and fear. The storage room door opened slowly, and Little Star peered out with wide, uncertain eyes. When she saw Jack, her face transformed with joy, but she didn't run to him. Instead, she looked back at Mary Ellen as if seeking permission. Mary Ellen's heart broke as she understood the child's confusion. Little Star had been cared for by strangers for so long that she no longer trusted her own instincts. Even when it came to recognizing her father, "It's all right, sweetheart," Mary Ellen said softly, kneeling down to the child's level. "This is your papa. He's been looking for you." Jack took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving his daughter's face. When he spoke, his voice was gentle and filled with emotion. "Hello, Little Star. I've missed you so much." The dam of Little Star's restraint finally broke. She ran across the kitchen and threw herself into Jack's arms. babbling in a mixture of English and Sioux. Jack gathered her close, his own eyes bright with unshed tears as he held the child he had thought he might never see again. Mary Ellen watched the reunion with mixed emotions, joy for the father and daughter who had found each other, but also a deep sadness as she realized that little Star would be leaving her. The brief time she had spent caring for the child had filled a void in her life she hadn't even realized existed. Henderson, meanwhile, was sobering up quickly as he grasped the implications of the situation. "Now see here," he blustered. "That girl, my maid, she had no right to harbor your child without permission. This is my property and this woman," Jack interrupted, still holding his daughter but fixing Henderson with a stare that could cut glass, "showed more Christian charity in a few days than you've probably shown in your entire life. My daughter was lost, hungry, and afraid. This lady took her in and cared for her like she was her own." Mary Ellen felt heat rise in her cheeks at the praise, especially coming from a man she barely knew. But there was something in Jack's voice when he spoke about her that made her heart skip. "What's your name?" Jack asked her directly, his tone gentling. "Mary Ellen," she replied quietly. "Mary Ellen Sullivan." "Mary Ellen Sullivan," he repeated, as if testing how it sounded. "My daughter speaks of you in both languages now. She calls you Ina Waste. Good mother." The words hit Mary Ellen like a physical blow. She had never expected to be anyone's mother, had given up hope of ever having a family of her own. To hear that this precious child thought of her in such terms was almost more than she could bear. Little Star twisted in her father's arms to look at Mary Ellen. "Mary Ellen Singh," she said proudly, her English clear despite her young age. "Pretty songs. Make scared go away." Jack's expression softened as he looked at Mary Ellen. "She told me about the singing, how it helped her sleep without nightmares." Henderson had been listening to this exchange with growing impatience and alarm. He was sober enough now to realize that having an Indian child on his property, even temporarily, could cause him serious problems with both the military and his neighbors. "This is all very touching," he said with false heartiness. "But the child's been found and now she can leave. Mary Ellen, you'll get back to your duties. And you," he pointed at Jack, "can take your daughter and get off my land." "It's not that simple," Jack said, his voice hardening again. "My daughter has been through a trauma. She needs time to adjust, to feel safe again. And she's formed an attachment to Miss Sullivan here." "That's not my problem," Henderson snapped. "I won't have Indians camping on my property." Jack was quiet for a long moment, studying Henderson with calculating eyes. When he spoke again, his voice carried a new note of authority. "Actually, Mr. Henderson, I think you'll find it is your problem. You see, I've been scouting for the Army in this territory for the past 3 years. I know which ranchers have been selling cattle to unauthorized traders, which ones have been grazing their herds on government land without permits, and which ones have been watering down their beef contracts with the forts." Henderson's face went from pale to ashen. "You can't prove anything, can I?" Jack smiled, and this time it was genuinely amused. "Would you like me to ride to Fort Harker tomorrow and discuss it with Colonel Morrison? I'm sure he'd be very interested in my observations." The threat was clear, and Henderson was trapped. His illegal activities had been noticed, and now this half-breed scout held that information like a weapon. The balance of power in the room had shifted completely. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope ready to snap. Henderson's face went through several shades of color as he realized the precarious position he was in. Jack Two Eagles held all the cards now, and they both knew it. "What do you want?" Henderson finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jack looked down at his daughter, who was still clinging to him, but watching Mary Ellen with longing eyes. Then he looked at Mary Ellen herself, taking in her worn dress, her work-roughened hands, and the way she stood with quiet dignity despite her obvious exhaustion. "I want," Jack said slowly, "for my daughter to have time to heal from what she's been through. And I want to make sure the woman who saved her life is properly compensated for her kindness." "Compensated?" Henderson sputtered. "She's just a maid. I already pay her wages." $3 a month, Mary Ellen said quietly, speaking up for the first time in several minutes. "And I sleep in the root cellar." Jack's eyes hardened as he looked at Henderson. $3? For the work of 3 people? That's not wages, that's theft." Henderson opened his mouth to argue, but Jack continued before he could speak. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to give Miss Sullivan a proper room in the main house, not some hole in the ground. You're going to pay her $15 a month, which is still less than she's worth. and you're going to treat her with the respect she deserves. $15. Henderson exploded. That's robbery. I won't. You will, Jack interrupted calmly. Or I'll be riding to Fort Harker at dawn with some very interesting stories about your business practices. Stories that might interest not just the Army, but also the territorial government and your fellow ranchers. Henderson's shoulders sagged in defeat. He was caught and he knew it. Fine, he muttered. But what about the child? I won't have an Indian living in my house permanently. Jack was quiet for a moment, thinking. Little Star had been through so much trauma that he was reluctant to uproot her again so soon. But he also couldn't stay at the Henderson ranch indefinitely. His work as a scout required him to travel, often for weeks at a time. I have an idea, Mary Ellen said hesitantly, looking between Jack and Little Star. What if Little Star stayed with me during the week and you could visit on weekends, at least until spring comes and the weather's better for traveling? The suggestion surprised everyone, including Mary Ellen herself. She hadn't planned to speak up, but seeing the confusion and fear in Little Star's eyes had moved her to action. The child needed stability, and Mary Ellen found herself wanting to provide it. Jack studied her face carefully. That would be a significant burden on you. Little Star can be challenging when she's scared or upset, and taking care of her on top of your other duties. It wouldn't be a burden, Mary Ellen said firmly. It would be a gift. I've been alone for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone who needed me. Someone who cared about me. Her voice broke slightly on the last words, and Jack felt something twist in his chest. This woman had obviously endured her own share of loneliness and hardship. The fact that she was willing to take on additional responsibility, not for money but out of love, told him everything he needed to know about her character. Little Star, meanwhile, had been following the conversation as best she could. She looked up at her father with hopeful eyes and spoke rapidly in Sioux, gesturing toward Mary Ellen. Jack laughed softly at his daughter's words. She says she wants to stay with her good mother, but she also wants her papa to visit every day if possible. Every day might be difficult, Mary Ellen said. But Mr. Henderson won't object to evening visits, will you, Mr. Henderson? The rancher looked like he wanted to object very much, but one glance at Jack's watchful eyes made him reconsider. I suppose, he said grudgingly, as long as it doesn't interfere with the work. It won't, Mary Ellen promised. I'll make sure of that. Jack knelt down to Little Star's level and spoke to her in both English and Sioux, explaining the arrangement. The child listened gravely, then nodded and threw her arms around his neck. She understands, Jack said, standing up again, and she's happy with the plan. But Miss Sullivan, I want you to know that this arrangement comes with conditions. Mary Ellen raised an eyebrow. What kind of conditions? First, you'll accept payment for caring for Little Star. I won't have you working even harder for no additional compensation. Mary Ellen started to protest, but Jack held up his hand. Second, if Henderson here gives you any trouble, and I mean any trouble at all, you send word to me immediately. I'll be camping nearby for the next few weeks, and I can be here within an hour if needed. Henderson shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. The threat was clear enough. Third, Jack continued, his voice softening as he looked at Mary Ellen. You must promise to take care of yourself as well as my daughter. You look like you haven't had a proper meal or a full night's sleep in months. Mary Ellen felt heat rise in her cheeks again. No one had expressed concern for her well-being in years. The simple kindness of his words brought tears to her eyes that she quickly blinked away. I promise, she said quietly. Jack nodded, satisfied. Then we have an agreement. Henderson, I trust you'll honor your part in this arrangement. Do I have a choice? Henderson muttered. There's always a choice, Jack replied mildly. You can choose to be a decent human being, or you can choose to explain your business practices to Colonel Morrison. I'm perfectly happy either way. Henderson glared at him but nodded his reluctant agreement. Fine. The girl gets a room upstairs and $15 a month. But I expect the same amount of work to get done. More work will get done, Mary Ellen said with quiet confidence. When people are treated fairly, they work better. Little Star tugged on Mary Ellen's skirt, and when Mary Ellen looked down, the child spoke in careful English. Mary Ellen happy now? The simple question nearly undid Mary Ellen completely. She knelt down and gathered Little Star into her arms. Yes, sweetheart. Mary Ellen is very happy now. Jack watched this exchange with growing warmth in his chest. His daughter had been through terrible trauma, losing her mother, then her grandmother, then being lost and alone for weeks. But somehow this gentle woman had reached her heart and begun the healing process. "I should go," Jack said reluctantly. "It's late and little Star needs her sleep. But I'll be back tomorrow evening to check on both of you." "Where will you stay?" Mary Ellen asked, concern evident in her voice. "I have a camp about 2 miles from here near the creek. Don't worry about me. I've slept under the stars more often than under a roof." Little Star ran to her father for one more hug, chattering to him in Sioux. Jack answered her in the same language, then translated for Mary Ellen's benefit. "She's telling me about the songs you taught her, and how you made her a soft bed, and how you shared your food even when you didn't have much. She wants to know if you'll teach her more songs tomorrow." "All the songs she wants to learn," Mary Ellen promised, stroking the child's dark hair. Jack headed toward the door, then paused and turned back. "Miss Sullivan." "Mary Ellen, thank you. What you did for my daughter, caring for her when you didn't know who she was or where she came from. That took courage and kindness. I won't forget it. She's a special child," Mary Ellen replied. "Anyone would have done the same." Jack shook his head. "No, they wouldn't have. Most people would have turned her over to the authorities or sent her away. You opened your heart to a stranger's child, and that says everything about who you are." After Jack left, Henderson stood in the kitchen looking sullen and defeated. "I hope you're satisfied," he said to Mary Ellen. "That half-breed has me over a barrel." "Mr. Henderson," Mary Ellen said quietly but firmly, "that man just ensured that your daughter will be safe and cared for, and that I'll be treated fairly for my work. If you can't see the decency in that, then perhaps you should examine your own heart." Henderson stomped out of the kitchen without another word, leaving Mary Ellen alone with Little Star. The child looked up at her with tired but peaceful eyes. "Sing?" Little Star asked hopefully. Mary Ellen smiled and lifted the child into her arms. "Of course, sweetheart. Let's go to your new room, our room, and I'll sing you to sleep." As they climbed the stairs to the guest room that would now be theirs, Mary Ellen marveled at how much her life had changed in a single evening. She had gone from being a friendless servant sleeping in a cellar to being a valued caregiver with a real room and fair wages. More importantly, she had gone from being utterly alone to having both a child to love and a man who seemed to genuinely care about her welfare. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in years, Mary Ellen allowed herself to hope that better days were coming. As she tucked Little Star into the clean, warm bed and began to sing softly, she felt something she had almost forgotten existed: the quiet joy of being exactly where she belonged. 3 months had passed since that fateful night in the Henderson kitchen, and the changes in Mary Ellen's life still felt like a dream. She woke each morning in a real bedroom with windows that let in actual sunlight, and she went to sleep each night with Little Star curled beside her, safe and loved. True to his word, Henderson had improved her working conditions dramatically. The fear of Jack's revelations about his business dealings had made him almost courteous, though Mary Ellen could see the resentment simmering beneath his forced politeness. Mrs. Henderson had been harder to convince, but even she had grudgingly admitted that Mary Ellen's work had improved since she was properly rested and fed. Jack visited every evening, just as he had promised. What had started as brief check-ins on his daughter had gradually evolved into longer conversations that Mary Ellen found herself anticipating throughout each day. He would arrive just as she was finishing the dinner cleanup, and they would sit in the kitchen while Little Star played nearby, talking quietly about everything and nothing. Mary Ellen learned that Jack had been educated at a mission school, which explained his perfect English and his ability to move between the white and Indian worlds. He told her stories of his scouting work, carefully edited for young ears, and she began to understand the dangerous nature of his job. He was trying to prevent war between his mother's people and the encroaching settlers, walking a tightrope between two cultures that often viewed him with suspicion. In return, Mary Ellen found herself sharing stories of her own past, her childhood in Missouri, her parents' death, the long years of loneliness and backbreaking work. Jack listened with an attention that made her feel like her experiences mattered, like her feelings were valid and important. Little Star blossomed under the consistent care and attention. Her English improved daily, and she began teaching Mary Ellen words in Sioux. The child's nightmares became less frequent, replaced by peaceful sleep, filled with the lullabies Mary Ellen sang each night. She grew stronger and more confident, laughing easily and playing with the simple toys Jack brought her during his visits. But it was the growing connection between Mary Ellen and Jack that surprised them both. What had begun as gratitude and shared concern for Little Star was developing into something deeper and more complex. Mary Ellen found herself watching for his approach each evening, her heart beating faster when she heard his footsteps on the porch. Jack, for his part, discovered that his visits to see his daughter had become visits to see Mary Ellen as well. One evening in late November, as the first snow of winter began to fall, Jack arrived looking more serious than usual. Little Star ran to greet him as always, but Mary Ellen could see the tension in his shoulders as he lifted his daughter for their customary hug. "What's wrong?" Mary Ellen asked quietly once Little Star had settled down to play with a cornhusk doll Jack had brought her. "There's trouble coming," Jack said, his voice low. "The army is planning a winter campaign against the Sioux. They want me to scout for them, but—" He trailed off, staring out the kitchen window at the swirling snow. Mary Ellen waited patiently for him to continue, having learned that Jack chose his words carefully. "I can't do it," he said finally. "I can't help them hunt my mother's people, even if some of those people no longer accept me as one of their own. And I can't leave Little Star again, not when she's just beginning to feel secure." Mary Ellen felt her heart clench with worry. "What will you do?" "I'm resigning my commission," Jack said firmly. "No more scouting. No more trying to serve two masters who both distrust me. It's time I chose a side." "And what side is that?" Mary Ellen asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. Jack looked at her directly, his dark eyes intense in the lamplight. "The side that includes you and Little Star. The side that feels like home." The words hung between them, loaded with meaning that neither was quite ready to address directly. Mary Ellen felt her cheeks warm, but she didn't look away from his gaze. "What will you do for work?" she asked practically, though her heart was racing. "Henderson owes me a debt," Jack said with a slight smile. "I think it's time he paid it. This ranch needs a good foreman, someone who knows how to deal with both the cattle and the increasing Indian troubles in the area. I think I could convince him that I'm the right man for the job." Mary Ellen couldn't help but smile at the thought of Henderson being forced to employ the very man who had backed him into a corner. "And if he refuses? Then we'll find another way," Jack said simply. "There are other ranches, other opportunities. The important thing is that we stay together, all three of us." The casual way he included her in his future plans made Mary Ellen's pulse quicken. "Jack, I know it's presumptuous of me," he said quickly. "I know we haven't known each other long, and I know I'm asking a lot. A half-breed scout with a daughter and no certain prospects isn't much of a catch for any woman." "Stop," Mary Ellen said firmly, surprising him into silence. "Don't you dare sell yourself short. You're a good man, Jack Two Eagles. You're kind and brave and intelligent. You love your daughter, and you've shown me more respect and consideration in 3 months than I received in 5 years of working for the Hendersons." Jack stared at her, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. "Mary Ellen, I love Little Star as if she were my own," Mary Ellen continued, the words tumbling out now that she had started. "And I care about you too. More than I probably should, more than is proper for a woman in my position." "Your position?" Jack asked, moving closer to where she stood by the kitchen table. "I'm just a maid." "Jack, I have nothing to offer except everything," Jack interrupted, reaching out to take her hands in his. "You have the biggest heart of anyone I've ever known. You took in a strange child without question. You sing like an angel, and you make both Little Star and me feel like we belong somewhere." Mary Ellen looked down at their joined hands, marveling at how right it felt. "People will talk," she said quietly. "A white woman with an Indian man—" "Let them talk," Jack said firmly. "I've spent my whole life trying to fit into worlds that only half accepted me. I'm tired of caring what other people think. The only opinions that matter to me are yours and Little Star's." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Little Star looked up from her doll and studied the two adults with wise eyes. She said something in Sioux that made Jack chuckle. "What did she say?" Mary Ellen asked. "She said it's about time we stopped dancing around each other like nervous horses," Jack translated, grinning. "She's been wondering when I was going to ask you to be her new mother officially." Mary Ellen looked at the little girl who had changed her life so completely. "And what do you think about that, Little Star? Would you like me to be your new mother?" Little Star dropped her doll and ran to Mary Ellen, wrapping her small arms around her waist. Yes! Mary Ellen be Ina and Papa be happy and we all stay together always. Always is a long time, Mary Ellen said, but she was smiling as she stroked the child's hair. Not long enough, Jack said softly, and when Mary Ellen looked up at him, she saw her own feelings reflected in his eyes. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the harsh prairie in white. But inside the warm kitchen, 3 people who had each known loneliness and loss were creating something new together. A family built not on blood or convention, but on love and choice and the courage to believe in tomorrow. When Jack kissed Mary Ellen for the first time, with Little Star cheering in both English and Sioux, Mary Ellen finally understood what it meant to be home. She was no longer just a maid working for her survival. She was a woman beloved, a mother cherished, and a partner in building a life that would be anything but ordinary. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain but full of promise, and every evening as Mary Ellen sang their daughter to sleep, Jack would join his voice with hers, creating harmonies that spoke of love transcending all boundaries.